He was a small boy, quiet and always a little different from the others. While other children ran around in the streets, shouting and playing, he would sit somewhere alone, his eyes drawn to the sounds that floated in the air. Music had a way of calling to him, a gentle pull that made his chest tighten with longing. He had never touched a piano in his life, but he imagined the feeling, the movement of his fingers across the keys, the sound that could fill a room and make people stop for just a moment. It was not a talent he had been born with, at least not yet, but it was something he wanted more than anything else. His family was poor, and though they loved him, they did not understand his fascination with music. They thought he should focus on more practical things, helping around the house, learning a trade, finding work, but he could not let go of the feeling he had when he thought about music. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit on the small wooden chair in the corner of their cramped home and hum melodies he made up, the sound barely audible over the wind outside. He did not care if anyone listened. The music was for him, a secret world where he felt alive. One day, a notice came to his school about a music program that would take place at the community center. A director, well-known and strict, was going to select children to participate. The boy felt a rush of hope. Could this be the chance he had been waiting for? He imagined himself playing in front of others, feeling the notes flow through him, the audience leaning forward in quiet amazement. He barely slept that night, turning the idea over and over in his mind. When he arrived at the community center, he felt a wave of nervousness. The room was large and filled with children who already seemed confident. Some carried music books. Some had instruments tucked under their arms. He had nothing but the hope that burned in his chest. When the director walked in, the room fell silent. He was a tall man with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through people. The boy's heart thumped so hard he thought it might burst. The director began to speak, and the boy listened closely. When it was time for him to step forward, he felt every eye in the room on him. He walked to the piano, his legs trembling. He had never touched a real piano before, only imagined it, and now here it was, waiting for him. His hands hovered above the keys, unsure and shaking. The director leaned back and laughed, a loud, sharp sound that echoed in the room. "He'll never perform," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The boy felt a pang of shame and fear. Everyone was watching. Did they all think the same thing? But then, something inside him shifted. The laughter, the doubt, the sneers of others, they did not matter. He pressed a key, just one, and the sound filled the space. It was small, hesitant, and slightly off, but it was real. And then he pressed another, and another, experimenting, learning, discovering the connection between his fingers and the notes. His heart lifted with each sound. The director frowned, leaning forward as if to stop him, but he could not. He could not stop himself from feeling the joy of those first simple notes. He spent every day after that trying to find a way to practice. The school piano was sometimes available, but mostly it was locked, and the boy had to be clever to sneak in. He learned to wait until everyone had left, tiptoeing down the hall, pushing the door open just enough to slip inside. He would sit, breathe in the familiar scent of old wood and polish, and run his fingers over the keys. First, it was painful. His hands were small, clumsy, and the sounds were uneven. But he did not stop. Each day he stayed longer, learning to control the pressure, to make the notes sound cleaner, to listen carefully to the sounds that came from the piano. Other children noticed him and teased him at first. They would laugh and call him names, saying he was wasting his time. He ignored them. He had learned that people who laughed often did so because they could not understand what they did not know. Music was his secret world, and he would protect it, nurture it, until one day it could not be ignored. Even his family began to doubt him. "Why do you spend so much time with that old piano?" his mother asked one evening. "You could be doing something that matters." But he simply smiled and said nothing, knowing that they would never understand the way the music made him feel alive, made him feel like he could breathe in a world that sometimes felt too small and too heavy. The boy started to memorize small pieces he had heard in passing. He would listen carefully, remember the sequence of notes, and then try to play them. At first, it was impossible. The sounds clashed, the rhythm stumbled, but he refused to quit. Slowly, he began to get it right. Each small success felt like a victory, a tiny spark of hope that told him he could really do this. And that hope grew, spreading through him, giving him the courage to dream bigger. One day, the director returned to the community center to observe the children. He walked past the piano where the boy sat, fingers hovering nervously above the keys. The boy took a deep breath and played, softly, cautiously, yet with growing confidence. The director paused, frowned, and then stepped back. The boy's heart raced. He had expected laughter, dismissal, maybe even anger. But instead, he was met with silence. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath along with him. The silence gave him courage. He pressed more keys, let the music flow, experimenting with rhythms and notes he had never dared to try before. He was no longer thinking about failure, about ridicule, about the words that had been spoken over and over. He was thinking only about the music, about the feeling it gave him in his chest, the way it made the room feel bigger, the way it allowed him to exist fully, completely, even if only for a few minutes. Days turned into weeks. The boy continued to practice in secret, learning to control his fingers, to anticipate the next note, to understand the story that the music wanted to tell. The laughter of the director echoed in his mind sometimes, sharp and cold, but it no longer mattered. He had found something stronger than doubt, stronger than fear. He had found a connection to music that could not be broken by anyone's disbelief. And still, the boy remained patient. He knew that one day, the world would hear what he could do. For now, it was enough to sit at the piano, to discover, to create, to grow. Each note was a step forward, each melody a promise. The director might laugh, the others might doubt, but the boy's heart was set, and nothing could take that away. Music had become his refuge, his challenge, and his dream all at once. It was not just sound. It was hope, it was courage, it was life. And he would keep chasing it, no matter what anyone said. After weeks of quiet practice, the boy grew bolder. Each day, he would rush to the community center, heart pounding, hoping no one would notice him slipping inside. The piano became his companion, almost like a friend who never judged him and never laughed. Sometimes he would imagine the piano speaking to him, guiding his fingers, encouraging him to reach for notes he had never dared to touch. He learned to listen to the subtle differences in sound, how pressing a key harder or softer could change everything. Every day brought a new discovery, and each discovery brought a small joy he could not find anywhere else. The boy began to experiment with melodies he had never heard before. He would hum a tune, then try to find the keys that matched. Sometimes he made mistakes, and the notes would clash in strange ways, but he did not stop. He learned that mistakes were not failures, but lessons. They taught him to pay attention, to notice the tiniest details, to develop patience. Slowly, he began to understand how to make the piano sing, not just produce sound. The community center was quiet most of the time, and the boy had to be careful. Occasionally, other children or staff would come in, and he would freeze, pretending he was doing something else. He had learned to hide in the corners, to slip behind the piano, to look natural even when his heart raced. But these small risks were worth it. The boy knew that every minute he spent with the piano was making him stronger, more confident, more skilled. He began to feel a sense of freedom he had never known before. In those moments, nothing else mattered. Not poverty, not ridicule, not even the sharp laugh of the director. Only the music mattered. One evening, while he was practicing a simple tune, the director happened to walk by. The boy's hands froze above the keys. The director's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the boy thought he would scold him or laugh or tell him to leave. But instead, the director just watched quietly, almost like he was studying the boy. The boy continued to play, hesitant at first, then with more confidence. The notes were shaky, but the melody was there. The director finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "Interesting," he said. The boy's heart leaped, but he did not allow himself to hope too much. He knew the director was unpredictable. That night, the boy lay in bed, thinking about what had happened. He wondered if the director had seen potential in him, or if it was just a passing thought. Either way, he felt encouraged. It was the first time someone who had doubted him had noticed the music he could create. The memory of the piano, the notes, the small victory, stayed with him, pushing him to practice even harder the next day. The boy started bringing scraps of paper and a pencil with him to the community center. He would write down small melodies, little patterns of notes he had discovered, so he would not forget them. Sometimes he would make up a simple story in his head and try to match it to music. A sad part of the story would have soft, slow notes, while a happy moment would have quick, playful keys. He began to understand that music was not just sound, but emotion, storytelling, expression. The piano was a way to speak without words, to tell a story that could touch people, even if only a few. Friends at school began to notice a change in him. He was more confident, more focused, less distracted by the teasing and ridicule. Some of them asked him to play for them during lunch breaks, or while they walked through the hallways. The boy was nervous, but he agreed. Slowly, others began to see the talent he had been nurturing in secret. Their reactions were a mix of surprise and admiration. It was strange for him, having people notice him for something he loved, something that had been entirely his own for so long. One rainy afternoon, the boy arrived at the community center to find the piano bench wet from a leak in the ceiling. Most children would have left disappointed, but he did not. He carefully wiped the bench, sat down, and began to play. The sound was softer, almost delicate, reflecting the rain tapping on the windows. He realized that the environment did not need to be perfect for music to exist. Music could thrive even in the smallest, most difficult places. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's skills continued to grow. He could play longer pieces, remember melodies more easily, and his fingers moved with more confidence. But he was still cautious about showing the full extent of his talent. The director's laughter, though distant now, still lingered in his mind. He wanted to be ready, perfect, before he ever faced such judgment again. This patience became his secret strength, teaching him discipline and resilience. One evening, while practicing a particularly difficult piece, the boy realized something important. He had fallen in love with the process itself, the act of learning and creating, not just the idea of performing. He understood that music was no longer a dream for the future. It was part of who he was. The piano had become a companion, a teacher, a mirror reflecting his determination and patience. The boy felt proud, not because anyone else recognized him, but because he had worked hard, pushed himself, and discovered the joy that came from creating something beautiful. Word of his dedication slowly reached the director again. This time, there was no laughter, only curiosity. The boy was invited to play during a small, informal gathering at the community center. He was nervous, but also excited. The audience was small, mostly children and staff, but he felt the same thrill he had imagined countless times. As he played, he noticed the director watching closely, eyebrows raised, expression thoughtful. The boy lost himself in the music, fingers moving faster, smoother, more confidently than ever before. By the end of the piece, a small applause filled the room. It was not grand, but it was enough. After that day, the boy felt a new sense of determination. He understood that recognition might not come immediately, and it might not come from everyone. But he also understood that the work he was doing mattered, that the hours spent practicing, the failures, the small victories, were shaping him into someone capable of more than he had ever imagined. Each note was a step forward, each melody a proof of his growing skill and perseverance. He continued to practice secretly, exploring new techniques, trying to challenge himself with more complex pieces. He discovered that even when no one was watching, music could teach him patience, focus, and resilience. He learned to forgive himself for mistakes, to experiment without fear, and to take pride in small improvements. Music had become not just a dream, but a teacher, a guide, and a companion that would stay with him no matter what obstacles lay ahead. And so, the boy grew stronger, quietly preparing for the day when the world could no longer ignore him. The piano was his sanctuary, and with every note, every melody, he was building the foundation for something greater. The laughter and doubt of others were no longer chains holding him back. They were challenges he could overcome. And in the quiet of the community center, with only the sound of the piano and the rain outside, the boy felt a sense of peace and determination that nothing could take away. The day finally came when the boy was asked to play in front of the director and a small group of people. It was not a big audience, but it was enough to make his stomach tighten with nerves. He had imagined this moment countless times while practicing alone, but reality felt different. His hands were shaky, his heart raced, and he worried that all the hours of secret practice might not be enough. The piano sat in front of him, polished and waiting, as if silently urging him to begin. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Every time he thought about the director's laugh, he felt a flash of fear, but he pushed it aside. This was his chance to show that all the hard work mattered, that the music he had been nurturing in secret had grown into something real. He positioned his fingers above the keys and pressed down. The first note sounded weak, almost uncertain, but it was there, and that was enough to start. The boy began slowly, cautious, careful to make no mistakes. The director watched him closely, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unyielding. A few other children stood nearby, curious to see if the boy could really play. He focused on the sound, letting the notes flow from his fingers. It was not perfect, but there was beauty in the way the music moved, in the way it told a story. With each note, his confidence grew, and his movements became more fluid. He had prepared a short piece, one he had practiced over and over. As he played, he noticed the subtle changes in the director's expression. The sharp eyes, the frown were still there, but there was a flicker of interest. The boy did not allow himself to look up too often. He needed to stay focused. The music had to speak for him. He pressed the keys with care, feeling each sound vibrate through the room. It was a moment of truth, the point where imagination met reality. The director leaned back slightly, a small shift that made the boy's heart skip a beat. Could it be that the man was impressed? He continued to play, now moving into parts that were slightly more difficult, parts that required both skill and feeling. The boy remembered all the hours spent practicing in secret, the tiny victories that had led to this moment. He felt their weight in his fingers, guiding him, giving him strength. When he finished, there was silence for a moment. The director stared at him, unreadable, and the other children blinked in surprise. The piece had been simple, but it had been played with care, precision, and emotion. For the first time, the boy saw something in the director's eyes that he had never seen before: respect. It was quiet, subtle, but it was real. The boy felt a thrill of hope rise in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, all the doubts were beginning to fade. The director finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You have potential," he said. The boy's heart leapt. The words were simple, but they carried weight. They were not a promise of fame or success, but they were an acknowledgement of the boy's dedication, his effort, his growth. That moment became a turning point. He realized that the hardest part was not the performance itself, but believing in himself when no one else did. From that day on, the boy was given more opportunities to play. He was still cautious, aware that not everyone would understand or support him. Some children were still skeptical, some teachers doubtful, but he no longer let their opinions shake him. The music had become a part of him, and he had learned that the joy it gave him could not be taken away by others' disbelief. The boy began experimenting with more complex pieces. He would arrive early at the community center, sometimes even before anyone else, and spend hours at the piano. He learned to control his fingers, to anticipate the sound, to balance speed with precision. He discovered new ways to express emotion through the keys, learning that every note could tell a story if played with feeling. He began to notice how the audience responded to his playing, how silence and attention could make the music more powerful. Even small achievements felt like victories. Learning a difficult passage, remembering a long sequence of notes, or simply playing a piece without stopping became milestones. The boy understood that success was not just about impressing others, but about mastering himself, his focus, and his emotions. Each day of practice brought new lessons, not only in music but in patience, perseverance, and self-belief. There were times when he struggled. Some pieces were too difficult, some melodies too confusing. He would get frustrated, his hands trembling, his mind full of doubt. But he had learned to keep going, to take a step back, breathe, and try again. Mistakes were no longer failures. They were part of the journey, signs that he was pushing himself, growing stronger, learning more. The piano had taught him resilience, the kind that could not be learned in any other way. Word of his growing skill began to spread slowly. A few staff members, some children, even parents who attended community center events noticed the boy's talent. They were curious, sometimes impressed, and occasionally surprised that someone so quiet and unassuming could create such music. It was strange for the boy to receive attention, but he did not seek it. The joy was in the music itself, not in recognition. Still, it was encouraging to see that others were beginning to appreciate his hard work. One afternoon, the director decided to test the boy further. He asked him to play a piece that the boy had never practiced before. The boy's stomach sank. He had imagined many performances, but never one where he was unprepared. He took a deep breath and approached the piano. He reminded himself of all the hours he had spent learning, the countless mistakes, the small victories. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. At first, the notes were hesitant, unsure. But then something remarkable happened. The boy began to hear patterns, to predict the flow, to adapt in real time. His hands moved with increasing confidence, and the unfamiliar piece started to take shape. By the end, the melody was complete, imperfect but beautiful. The director's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded in approval. It was the first time the boy had felt that he could truly rise to a challenge. That moment changed everything. The boy realized that preparation was important, but adaptability, courage, and focus were just as vital. Music was alive, and it demanded not only skill but creativity and resilience. He felt proud, not because of praise, but because he had trusted himself, even when the outcome was uncertain. That trust became a foundation for future growth, a lesson that would stay with him long after the notes faded. The boy continued to play, to experiment, to challenge himself. He learned to balance confidence with humility, to accept guidance without losing his own voice, to see mistakes as opportunities rather than setbacks. Each day was a new lesson, a chance to explore, and a step toward the dream he had nurtured in secret for so long. The director watched more often now, less skeptical and more curious, and the boy began to sense that a real opportunity was forming, one that could change everything. Slowly, the boy's reputation grew. People began to recognize him not only as a talented child, but as someone who had worked tirelessly, who had refused to give up despite doubt and ridicule. His story inspired others, though he did not see it that way. He was simply following the music, letting it guide him, letting it teach him about patience, courage, and the power of quiet determination. By the end of this period, the boy understood something profound. Success was not measured by applause or approval, but by growth, by the ability to face challenges, and by the courage to continue even when no one believed in him. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a teacher, a friend, and a mirror reflecting his own persistence. The director's initial laughter, once so sharp and discouraging, had become irrelevant. The boy had discovered his own strength, and it would carry him forward into the next stage of his journey, where greater challenges and triumphs awaited. After the first test in front of the director, the boy felt a new sense of confidence, though he remained cautious. He understood that every opportunity was precious and that he had to work harder than ever. The community center became his second home, a place where he could lose himself in music and continue to grow. He arrived early, often before the doors were officially open, and stayed late, long after everyone had left. Every key he pressed, every melody he attempted, became part of a larger journey, one that no one else fully understood yet. He began to explore more challenging pieces that required not only technical skill but emotion and understanding. At first, these new compositions felt impossible. His fingers stumbled, and the notes clashed in ways that frustrated him. But he did not stop. He reminded himself of all the hours spent in secret practice, of all the failures that had taught him patience and perseverance. Each mistake was a step forward, each small victory a sign that he could push beyond what he had thought possible. The boy also started experimenting with his own melodies. He would hum a tune, then try to translate it to the piano. Sometimes it worked beautifully, other times it fell flat. But he loved the process, the challenge of turning an idea from his mind into sound. He began to understand that music was not only about perfection, but about expression. Each note carried emotion, and each piece told a story. He discovered that his own feelings, both joy and sorrow, could be captured in music, and that idea excited him more than any praise ever could. Word of his dedication slowly spread. Staff members and a few children who had witnessed his progress began to take notice. Some approached him, asking to hear him play, curious about the music that had captured his attention so completely. The boy was nervous at first, unsure how to perform in front of others, but he gradually learned to embrace these small audiences. With each performance, no matter how modest, he gained confidence and skill. He discovered that playing for others was different from playing alone. It required awareness, control, and sensitivity to how the music was received. Challenges still came. There were days when he felt exhausted, when the pieces seemed too difficult, when his hands refused to move the way he wanted. On such days, he would sit at the piano, close his eyes, and let his mind wander, remembering why he loved music in the first place. Slowly, he would regain focus, begin again, and learn to accept that growth often required patience and resilience. He learned that determination was not just about trying hard, but about continuing even when success seemed distant. The director began to watch him more closely, no longer dismissive, but curious and occasionally impressed. He would attend rehearsals, asking the boy to play pieces he had never practiced, testing his adaptability and creativity. At first, these requests made the boy nervous, but he learned to trust his instincts, to listen to the music within him, and to respond confidently. He discovered that true skill was not only memorization, but understanding, intuition, and the courage to take risks. As his abilities grew, the boy began performing at small events held at the community center. Parents, staff, and other children would gather to listen. Though the audiences were not large, the boy felt a thrill each time he played. He learned to gauge the room, to notice reactions, and to adjust the emotion in his playing accordingly. The applause was not what drove him. It was the connection he felt through the music, the way it could make people pause, listen, and feel. One day, a broken piano at the center forced him to adapt once again. He had to make do with a keyboard that was missing keys and produced uneven sounds. It was frustrating, but he realized that music was not limited by equipment. It was about expression and creativity. He learned to compensate for missing keys, to use the imperfections to his advantage, and to discover new ways to create melodies. This challenge taught him flexibility and problem-solving, and he found joy in overcoming obstacles. Even among friends, some children still doubted him. They would whisper, question whether he could truly perform, or suggest he focus on something more practical. But the boy had learned to ignore such comments. He understood that their doubts reflected their own limitations, not his potential. Each note he played was a declaration of perseverance, a quiet statement that he would not be defined by others' expectations. The boy's family began to notice a change in him. Though they still did not fully understand his passion, they could see the dedication and focus it inspired. They observed how he practiced diligently, how he overcame obstacles, how he remained calm in challenging situations. Slowly, they began to offer support, providing encouragement in small ways, making sure he had time to practice, listening to his music, and acknowledging his progress. Their recognition was not the motivation, but it strengthened his resolve. At this point, the boy started to develop his own style. He combined what he had learned from practice with the melodies he invented, creating music that was uniquely his. He played with expression and nuance, paying attention to dynamics, tempo, and emotion. He discovered that music could convey subtle feelings, joy, sadness, hope, longing, that words could never capture. Each performance became a personal journey, a way to communicate his inner world to others. The director, observing these performances, could no longer deny the boy's talent. Though still stern, he began offering guidance, suggesting techniques and ways to improve. The boy absorbed these lessons, integrating them into his playing while maintaining his own voice. The combination of mentorship and self-discovery accelerated his growth, making him not only more skilled, but more confident and expressive. The boy faced setbacks, of course. Occasionally, he would make mistakes during performances or struggle with particularly difficult pieces. But he had learned to embrace these moments as part of the process, to see them as opportunities for improvement rather than failures. Each challenge strengthened his patience, resilience, and determination. He realized that perseverance was as important as talent, and that success depended on consistent effort, learning from mistakes, and refusing to give up. Over time, the boy's music began to touch people in ways he had never imagined. Audience members at community events would pause, listen attentively, and respond with genuine emotion. Some were moved to tears, others to quiet reflection, and some simply smiled, absorbed in the beauty of the sound. The boy realized that music had the power to connect people, to express what could not be spoken, and to create moments of shared feeling. This understanding deepened his love for the piano, making every practice, every performance, even more meaningful. With each passing day, the boy's dedication, skill, and unique voice continued to grow. He learned that recognition, though gratifying, was not the ultimate goal. The true reward was in the journey itself, in the quiet moments of discovery, the challenges overcome, the music created, and the emotions conveyed. He understood that his path was not easy, but it was worth every effort, every late night, every early morning, and every mistake turned into a lesson. By the end of this period, the boy had grown into a confident, skilled, and expressive musician. The director, once dismissive and laughing, now watched with respect, occasionally offering guidance, and allowing the boy to explore his abilities freely. The boy had learned not only how to play the piano but how to embrace challenges, persevere, and remain true to himself. His music had become a reflection of his journey, his dedication, and his inner strength, setting the stage for the next phase of his story, where he would face his greatest test and ultimate triumph. The day of the big performance finally arrived. The boy felt a mix of excitement and nerves that he had never experienced before. This was different from practicing alone or performing in small gatherings at the community center. Now, a larger audience would be watching, and the director would be there judging, observing, and expecting something from him. The boy took a deep breath, trying to calm the rapid beating of his heart. Every step he had taken until now had led to this moment. Every hour of secret practice, every mistake, every small victory, all of it had prepared him. He stepped onto the stage, the lights warm and bright, illuminating the piano that had become a part of him. The audience was quiet, attentive, and he could feel their eyes upon him. He sat down, adjusted his posture, and placed his fingers above the keys. The memory of the director's laugh and doubt flashed in his mind, but he pushed it aside. That laughter no longer had power over him. He had worked too hard, learned too much, and grown too strong to be shaken by words from the past. He pressed the first key, a clear, confident note that filled the room. Slowly, he allowed the music to flow, letting each note guide him. He played with focus, feeling the rhythm in his chest, listening to the resonance of each sound. The boy poured all his practice, emotion, and creativity into the performance. He was no longer just playing. He was speaking through the piano, telling a story without words, sharing his heart with everyone listening. The audience was silent, captivated by the music. The boy felt a sense of connection he had never known before. Each note was a conversation, each melody a bridge between his heart and theirs. He played with nuance, expression, and confidence, allowing his fingers to move freely, guided by instinct and emotion. The pieces he had once struggled with now seemed to flow naturally, a testament to his dedication and growth. The director, who had once laughed and doubted him, watched silently. There was no smirk, no judgment, only attention and gradually admiration. The boy could see it in the slight softening of his expression, the way his eyes followed each movement of the boy's hands. For the first time, the director truly witnessed the talent, effort, and perseverance that had been building quietly for years. As the performance continued, the boy lost himself completely in the music. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the world outside the stage fading away. He felt every note, every pause, every rise and fall of the melody. He remembered every struggle, every hour of practice, every moment of doubt and determination. All of it came together in a single, powerful expression that filled the room with beauty and emotion. By the time he reached the final notes, the boy's hands were steady, his heart full. He played with a clarity and confidence that surprised even him. The last note lingered in the air, resonating with a quiet power, and then silence fell. For a moment, there was no sound, only the impression of what had just been created. Then the audience erupted in applause, cheers, and claps. The boy felt a wave of relief, joy, and pride that he had never experienced before. He had done it. He had proven not just to others, but to himself, that all his effort and belief had been worth it. The director stood, clapping, a rare smile on his face. He approached the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have grown beyond what I expected," he said, his voice sincere. "Your dedication, your talent, your courage, it is all remarkable." The boy felt a surge of gratitude. These words, simple but honest, were more meaningful than any applause. They were acknowledgement, recognition, and respect from someone who had once doubted him. After the performance, the boy was approached by audience members who shared how moved they had been by the music. Some had tears in their eyes. Others had smiled quietly, lost in thought. They asked him to play more, to teach others, to share his gift. The boy realized that his music had the power to touch people, to inspire, to communicate in a way words could not. He understood that his journey was no longer about secret practice or proving himself. It was about connecting, sharing, and inspiring others through the art he loved. The boy returned home that night with a sense of peace and fulfillment he had never known. He thought about how far he had come, from the small, timid child who dreamed of music to the confident performer who had captured the hearts of an audience. Every struggle, every failure, every hour of practice had contributed to this moment. He had learned lessons in patience, perseverance, humility, and courage. He had discovered the joy of creation, the power of expression, and the strength of believing in oneself. In the following weeks, the boy continued to perform, taking on more challenging pieces, exploring new melodies, and pushing his limits further. He no longer feared mistakes, for he understood that growth came from effort, resilience, and learning. Each performance was an opportunity to explore, to express, and to connect. He began teaching smaller children, sharing the lessons he had learned, inspiring them to find their own paths and trust in their abilities. The director, who had once doubted him so sharply, became a mentor and supporter. He offered guidance, challenged the boy with new techniques, and encouraged him to expand his repertoire. The boy welcomed the advice, but he also maintained his unique voice, combining technical skill with emotion and creativity. This balance became the hallmark of his style, a reflection of both discipline and individuality. The boy's family, now fully aware of his talent and dedication, supported him wholeheartedly. They took pride not only in his skill but in his growth as a person. They saw how music had shaped him, teaching patience, focus, and resilience, and they understood that his journey was about more than performance. It was about becoming the best version of himself. Over time, the boy's story began to inspire others. Friends, classmates, and community members admired his perseverance and courage. They saw how dedication, hard work, and belief in oneself could overcome doubt and obstacles. The boy had become a living example of how passion and effort could turn dreams into reality, and his music carried that message without words, touching hearts and inspiring minds. Reflecting on his journey, the boy realized that the true reward had never been applause or recognition. The reward was the growth, the learning, the courage to continue despite doubt, and the joy of creating something beautiful. Music had given him a voice, a purpose, and a path that would carry him through life. It had taught him that perseverance and passion could overcome even the sharpest doubts, and that belief in oneself was the most powerful tool of all. As the boy looked toward the future, he felt ready for anything. He knew that challenges would continue, that obstacles would appear, but he also knew that he had the tools, the discipline, and the courage to face them. Music would always be his guide, his companion, and his expression. And in every note he played, every melody he created, he would carry the lessons of his journey, the power of persistence, the beauty of expression, and the strength of believing in oneself. The boy had started as a timid dreamer, doubted and underestimated. But through patience, effort, and unyielding belief, he had transformed into a confident musician capable of touching lives and inspiring hearts. His story was not just about music. It was about the human spirit, about resilience, courage, and the extraordinary results of unwavering dedication. He had proven that even the quietest, most overlooked individuals could rise to greatness when they dared to follow their dreams, and that the laughter of doubters could become the fuel for success rather than a barrier. The boy had finally realized his potential, and the world could no longer ignore him.